Before viewing video lessons, it is important to read the textbook using the learning guide as your turn-by-turn directions. Then use the learning guide to take organized notes in your own words with examples and pictures.
So let's talk about our statistics here. So I'm going to start down at the cyclothymic and we'll kind of work our way up. So cyclothymia, up to 1% of the population, but that's a little bit misleading because some of those people go on to develop a bipolar 1 or bipolar 2 diagnosis. So about half of people start out with this cyclothymia. It ends up being something else. The average age of onset for cyclothymia is 12 to 14. For bipolar 2, we see that the prevalence is below 1%, and the average age of onset is later. So we're talking about people in early adulthood, 19 to 22. Now, some of those people eventually have a diagnostic change because they develop a manic episode later, and so about a quarter of those people will later be diagnosed with bipolar 1. And so bipolar 1 is a little over 0.5%. This is a relatively rare diagnosis compared to some of the other diagnoses we've talked about. And the average age of onset for this is 15 to 18 years old. But again, just like when we talked about depression, you can have people diagnosed at younger ages, and you can also have people diagnosed for the first time at an older age. This is just kind of an average. But again, puberty, adolescence, final phase of brain development that occurs between about ages 12 and 25 seems to be the time period most frequently.
Yeah, I found that puberty calmed me down. Because when I was a child, like elementary, middle school, like the first year of high school, I was bipolar too. There's no question about it. I was.
And that,
but then I hit like.
And that's not what we see for most people. For most people, we see puberty serves as the trigger for the mood disruptions. And so
when I got sophomore, junior year, I started.
So it's important to note that when we talk in class about statistics and patterns, we're talking about the average, but there's all kinds of exceptions to the average and the norm.
So
here's what the statistics say about this. The percentages are relatively equal between men and women. This is one of the reasons why we think what's going on is not the same thing as depression. Because remember, depression, we had 4 times as likely in women. And now we have a disorder that is pretty much equal between men and women. Something else is going on with this. This is not the same thing. Even though you might have depressive episodes, it's caused by something different. It can begin in childhood, but that's not the most common pattern. Once somebody develops one of these diagnoses, then it tends to be a chronic, lifelong condition. So the people who have the ups and downs, whether they're the mild cyclothymic or the more extreme, all the way to bipolar 1, they're going to cycle through times when they're high, times when they're low, times when they're stable. Suicide risk is high. Bipolar 1, 15% higher risk. A quarter of all people who die from suicide have a bipolar diagnosis. So it's a big, big risk factor. So what causes this? Well, as I said, it's not the same set of causative factors as depression, which is why we're talking about it separately. It appears to be primarily a neurologically, biologically based disorder with stress serving as the trigger for the first hypomanic or manic episode. but it's different from the stress that triggers depression. The stress that tends to trigger the first episode is what we sometimes call good stress or eustress. Stress where you're really excited about something and you're preparing for a challenge or a competition or trying to meet a goal that you're really excited about. So let's talk about some of those biological factors. As Ashley mentioned, there does appear to be a genetic basis, but it's not a single gene. It's multiple genes that interact. We are particularly interested in genes related to dopamine regulation. Dopamine seems to be a neurotransmitter that is at play in the bipolar disorders. So when we do family studies, and we look at first-degree relatives, so that would be parent and child, those are first-degree relatives. That's where we see the highest rate. We don't see an increased risk for depression. So if my mom has bipolar, I have an increased risk for bipolar. Don't have any elevated increased risk for depression. So the biological genetic underpinnings of this are different from depression. Depression and anxiety share biological vulnerability. Bipolar and schizophrenia seem to be more closely linked. So if my mom has bipolar 1, I have a high risk of bipolar. I have an elevated, not as high, risk for developing schizophrenia or a psychotic disorder. So something about the vulnerability for bipolar is shared with the vulnerability for schizophrenia. Ashley.
And it's weird because my cousin, so it's my dad's older sister's son, how we are related by my father and his sister. That's not where he gets schizophrenia, but he is by his father's, and he has a twin. It's male and female twins. She doesn't have it, but she's a carrier. And he has
it's not a carrier because it's not a genetic disorder. She's a carrier for the vulnerability.
Yeah,
right?
Yes, but then also it's weird because my dad's side, my grandfather, before he died, he was an extreme gambler, so it's like very flamboyant about that. So that's where we think I also got it.
Yeah. So thinking about twins here, with bipolar, we see that twins do have an increased risk, 10 times more likely. So if I have a twin, an identical twin, so this would be my twin sister. If I have an identical twin, then and she has bipolar, I'm 10 times more likely to have bipolar. So the other thing that is interesting, and this was similar to depression, the more severe my relative's diagnosis, the stronger the genetic contribution seems to be. So if my mom has cyclothymic disorder, my risk is higher. If she has bipolar 1, my risk is much higher. Does that make sense? So we believe that this is a biological based disorder. And what we think is going on biologically. So we know the genes are there, but what are the genes influencing? A couple of things. One has to do with the amygdala and basal ganglia. These are all parts of the limbic system, the emotional system in the brain. And what we see is a hyperactivity in those regions, hyper-emotional reactivity. Would that make sense for a disorder who has these extreme emotions? It only makes sense, but we can actually see that there's extra activity there. We also see, similar to depression, reduced hippocampus volume. And that may be why there are depressive episodes with this. It may be that the mania damages the hippocampus, which is putting us at risk for the depression. We don't know. We also see reduced prefrontal cortex activity. And this is something that's shared with schizophrenia. So there's less activity here in the logical, think things through, plan, put thoughts before action part of the brain. And the emotional, impulsive part of the brain in the deeper parts, the amygdala and the basal ganglia, are ruling the day. So we're much more impulsive and emotionally reactive and less thoughtful, planful. I already mentioned that we are interested in dopamine, and so we think kind of two things happen with bipolar disorder. We think dopamine is at a higher level than it should be. At the same time, serotonin is at a lower level. So that's what we think happens with bipolar disorder. Sleep, much like depression, sleep is kind of a mixed bag. Sleep disturbance is a part of bipolar disorders. And we know that for some people, sleep deprivation can trigger mania. So staying up all night working on a project can serve as a trigger. And then the final thing was the stressful life events. Again, good stressors striving towards a goal can be the trigger for your first episode of mania or hypomania. But once you have that first episode, there's kind of a biological switch that has been flipped. And after that, any form of stress can be a trigger for episodes. So both the good stress and the bad stress, once you've had that first manic episode, can trigger mania, hypomania, or depression. So again, it's kind of a biological switch. And then there are the psychosocial factors. Psychosocial factors don't cause bipolar. It is caused by biological factors. They can complicate these episodes. So some of those psychosocial factors are related to the good stress, the goal engagement life events, those good stressors. Also, anything that disrupts the social rhythm of life, particularly sleep-wake cycles. What could disrupt that? I don't know. Finals week, pandemics, becoming a parent, being physically sick, all these different things can cause a disruption. So this is part of it. And then for depressive episodes within a disorder with mania or hypomania, seem to be triggered by the same types of things that trigger other depressive episodes. So those would be things like negative life events, low social support. High EE means high emotional expression in the family. And that does not mean good emotion. It doesn't mean, oh, we're just such a happy, loving family that loves each other so much. It means yelling, screaming, name calling, putting down, slamming door kind of emotions. Overall neuroticism, worrying, and a negative cognitive style.